Sometimes the scariest monsters don't hide in shadows. They sit beside you in classrooms, smile at you in grocery lines, and wave across the street. Clara Hayes never thought she could become one of them. She believed in kindness, in fairness, in doing right, no matter how hard life pressed against her. But the truth about human nature isn't comforting, it's unsettling. And Clara was about to discover just how thin the line between good and evil really was. She first tasted that truth years ago in a lecture hall filled with restless students. Her psychology professor wrote 4 words on the chalkboard: the Stanford Prison Experiment. The room grew quiet, like a warning bell nobody wanted to hear. Clara listened as he described young men who volunteered to play guards and prisoners. Within days, the guards, normal students, no different than her classmates, transformed into They shouted, bullied, even humiliated the ones assigned as prisoners. Nothing had forced them. No threats, no rewards, just the power of a role. Clara remembered the professor's words almost verbatim. Sometimes it's not the bad people you should fear. It's the ordinary ones who never imagined themselves capable of cruelty. That sentence burned into her mind. She'd walked home that night with her notes tucked under her arm, but something heavier pressed on her chest. She asked herself a question she never wanted answered. If it had been me, would I have turned cruel too? Years later, Clara had built a quiet life. At 29, she taught literature in a public high school, cared for her widowed mother, and lived in a rented apartment with cracked walls and a shelf full of half-read novels. She was good, at least she believed so. But goodness has a way of being tested. It began with change. A new principal arrived at the school, a man who thrived on rules and discipline, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. He pushed teachers to control, to dominate, to remind the kids who held the power. Clara despised his methods. She loved guiding students gently, showing them the beauty of stories instead of forcing obedience. But disagreement came with consequences. Her hours cut, her ideas dismissed, a threat always lingering in the silence. Fall in line, or you're out. And then came the moment she couldn't take back. Jason, 16, restless, defiant, refused to sit down during her lesson. Clara tried patience first, but the principal happened to be passing by. His cold gaze landed on her, waiting. Clara felt her throat tightened. If she let Jason win, she would look weak. Her career dangled by a thread. The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. Sharp, commanding, louder than she had ever spoken in that classroom. Jason froze. His classmates stared, and the principal nodded in approval before walking on. What unsettled Clara wasn't just the silence that followed. It was what she felt inside. For the first time, she realized that cruelty could feel powerful.
The first fracture came at home. Clara's mother noticed her change before anyone else. One evening, Clara snapped when her mother asked if she'd remembered to pay a bill. "Yes, Mom. I'm not a child." The sharpness in her voice filled the room like broken glass. Her mother blinked, stunned. "Clara, what's happening to you?" The question hit harder than she expected. What was happening to her? She wanted to apologize, to fall into her mother's arms and confess everything. But instead, Clara mumbled something about stress and retreated to her room. Inside, she stared at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The woman staring back looked familiar, but different, harder, colder, a stranger hiding behind her own eyes. She whispered again, as though speaking it aloud could make it true. "I'm still good." But the words didn't sound like hers anymore. That night, she opened her old psychology notes once more. She found the scribbled line from years ago. Would I become cruel too? Her hands shook as she underlined it again and again until the pen nearly tore through the paper. The truth was clawing its way closer. Clara could feel it. Her life was no longer about who she was, it was about who she was becoming. And the question wasn't whether she would cross the line. The question was, how far will she go once she does? Clara Hayes used to believe every wrong choice came with a warning bell, a clear moment where the world whispered, "Are you sure you want to do this?" But the truth was far more terrifying. Darkness never arrived with alarms. It came silently, disguised as necessity, slipping under your skin before you even noticed. After the day she snapped at Jason, Clara thought the guilt would fade. It didn't. It followed her into the teacher's lounge, where the stale smell of burnt coffee clung to the air. It followed her on the bus ride home, the hum of the engine drowning out her thoughts but never quieting them. And it waited for her in her mother's living room, where her mother's frail voice asked softly, "You're doing okay at work, right?" Clara lied, smiling as if the truth wasn't eating her alive. "Yeah, Mom, everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. Her principal's approval had unlocked something dangerous. He stopped criticizing her. He even praised her once in a staff meeting. "Ms. Hayes knows how to keep her class in order." The words sank like poison, twisting inside her. She hated them, yet she felt a strange thrill too. For years, Clara had been overlooked, just another quiet teacher with no authority. Now, people noticed her, and the currency she had gained was fear. The next test came quickly. Jason again. It was a Friday afternoon, the room heavy with boredom, when he cracked a joke during a reading exercise. The students laughed, their voices filling the room with reckless energy. Clara's pulse spiked. For a brief moment, she wanted to laugh, too wanted to be the teacher she used to be. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. The principal, standing in the doorway, watching, always watching. Her decision snapped into place before she could think. "Jason, out, hallway, now." The room froze. Jason's smirk vanished. He muttered, seriously, but Clara didn't flinch. She held his gaze until he dropped his books and walked out. The laughter evaporated, replaced by silence. And the principal nodded once more, that slight approval that now weighed more than gold. But when Jason stood in the hallway, his shoulders tight, his face pale with humiliation, Clara's chest twisted. She remembered herself at his age powerless under authority, silenced when all she wanted was to be heard. For a fleeting second, she nearly stepped into the hall to comfort him. Nearly. Instead, she stayed at her desk, gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. That night, she dreamed of endless hallways lined with heavy steel doors. Behind each door came muffled cries, pleading, begging, voices that sounded like her students. She held a ring of keys in her hand, but her feet wouldn't move. A voice, eerily like her own, whispered inside her skull, "You decide who suffers. You decide who gets free." She woke tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, her throat raw from a scream she didn't remember releasing. Work grew worse. Authority spread like a sickness. She noticed even her gentlest colleagues snapping, shouting, punishing more harshly. It wasn't just her. The poison of power had infected the whole building. And once cruelty became normal, resisting it felt like rebellion. Clara told herself she was different, that she still cared, but each outburst chipped away at that belief. The first fracture outside of school came at home. One evening, her mother asked if she had remembered to pay a bill. A small, harmless question. Clara's voice erupted before she realized what she was doing. "Yes, Mom, I'm not a child." The sharpness echoed off the walls like shattered glass. Her mother froze, stunned, her frail hands trembling. "Clara, what's happening to you?" The words pierced deeper than any reprimand. Clara wanted to apologize, to fall into her mother's arms and confess everything. Instead, she muttered something about stress and stormed off to her bedroom. In the bathroom, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman staring back looked familiar but altered, her jaw tighter, her eyes colder, a stranger peering out from behind her face. She whispered, "I'm still good. I am." But the words sounded hollow, fragile, as if they belonged to someone else. Later that night, she dug out her old psychology notes, flipping until she found the scribbled line that had haunted her since college. Would I become cruel too? Her hand shook as she traced it, pressing her pen hard until it nearly tore the paper. She didn't need to wonder anymore. The answer was already unfolding, and the darker thought that crept into her mind was far more dangerous than guilt. What if cruelty doesn't just survive inside me? What if deep down I begin to want it? Clara Hayes used to walk through the school halls with warmth. She remembered smiling at her students, stopping to ask how their weekends went, sometimes even laughing at their silly jokes. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else, a distant ghost she could no longer touch. Now, when she walked the halls, the students looked away. Whispers followed her, hushed and fearful. Some straightened in their seats the second she entered the classroom, as if her presence itself demanded obedience. It should have made her proud. Instead, it filled her with something more complicated, an ache she couldn't name, tangled with a dangerous satisfaction she didn't want to admit. The fracture in her mask widened when she saw Jason again. He no longer challenged her in class. He avoided eye contact, kept his voice low, and never laughed too loud. The boy who once buzzed with restless energy now seemed smaller, dimmer. Clara noticed, and it scared her, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the guilt, another voice whispered, "You did that. You broke him." And part of you liked it. She pushed the thought away, burying herself in routines. But routines no longer felt safe. The entire school seemed to pulse with a darker rhythm now. Teachers barked orders like drill sergeants. Students tiptoed through halls, afraid of punishment. And the principal, always the principal, walked like a king surveying his domain, silent approval in every glance. Clara told herself she was surviving, that she was doing what needed to be done. Yet late at night, when the building was empty and her footsteps echoed against the tiled floor, she sometimes felt as if the walls themselves were watching her. Like the school was alive, feeding on fear, reshaping her in its image. The breaking point came one afternoon when a girl named Marissa forgot her homework. She was quiet, shy, a student Clara had always felt protective over. In the past, Clara would have reassured her, reminded her gently to do better next time. But that day, with the principal lingering near the doorway, Clara's voice turned sharp. "Unacceptable, Marissa. You'll stay after class." The girl's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes. My dad's in the hospital. Clara cut her off before she could finish. "Excuses won't help you here." The room fell silent. Clara's heart hammered. She saw the pain on Marissa's face, the tears she tried to hide, and yet Clara didn't take it back. She couldn't, because she felt the principal's gaze burning into her from the hall, waiting, judging. Marissa left school that day with red eyes, clutching her books like a shield. Clara sat at her desk long after the students were gone, her throat dry, her chest tight. She had crossed a line she couldn't explain. This wasn't just discipline. This was cruelty. That night, she avoided her mother's eyes at dinner. Her mother spoke softly about her day, about the flowers blooming outside their window, but Clara barely heard. Her mind replayed Marissa's trembling voice. "My dad's in the hospital." The words pierced her like knives. After her mother went to bed, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. She flexed her fingers, remembering the power in her voice, the silence it commanded. It frightened her how much she remembered that silence not with shame, but with a strange, heavy craving. In the stillness, Clara whispered, "What's happening to me?" Her reflection in the dark window gave no answer, only her own face staring back, distorted by the glass. The nightmares returned. This time, she was back in the hallway of locked steel doors. Only now she wasn't holding keys. Her hands were bloodied from clawing at the locks. Behind the doors, the voices of her students screamed her name, begged her to stop. She pressed her palms against her ears, but the voices grew louder until one broke through Marissa's voice, trembling, accusing. "Why did you hurt me?" Clara jolted awake, gasping, her throat raw. She stumbled into the bathroom and gripped the sink. The cracked mirror reflected her pale face, her wild eyes. For a moment, she swore she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her hands trembled as she splashed water over her skin. She leaned closer to the mirror and whispered, "I'm still good. I have to be." But the reflection didn't agree. At school the next day, the whispers about Clara grew louder. Some students avoided her completely. Others stared at her with quiet resentment. Jason wouldn't even look up when she passed. Marissa sat with her head down, shrinking into herself. Clara felt the weight of every pair of eyes, every silent judgment. And yet, when the principal walked by and offered her that approving nod, she felt her spine straighten, her chest rise. That one gesture drowned out the guilt, if only for a moment. She realized then how easy it was to trade compassion for control, how tempting it was to believe that authority meant safety, but in the pit of her stomach, fear twisted tighter. Because Clara knew the truth, the mask she wore was slipping, and once it fell, there would be no hiding what lay beneath. By October, Clara Hayes had become someone her students no longer recognized. The whispers had spread like wildfire. "Ms. Hayes has changed. Don't mess with her." Some said it with fear, others with bitter resentment. Clara heard the murmurs in the halls, felt the tension in every classroom she entered. She told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was survival. What mattered was keeping her job, paying her mother's medical bills, keeping their fragile life from collapsing. But in the quiet moments when she was alone at night, her body heavy with exhaustion, she felt the truth gnawing inside her. The person she had been was slipping away, piece by piece. The crack widened the day she lost control. Jason again. He had become her shadow, the boy who always seemed to test her just when she was at her weakest. That morning, his laugh cut through the air like a challenge. Clara's nerves were already frayed. Her mother's hospital bills had doubled. The principal had tightened his grip on the staff, and her sleepless nights had begun to blur reality. "Jason," she snapped, her voice slicing through the classroom. "Stand up." He hesitated, eyes narrowing. "What for? Now?" She barked. The room froze. Jason rose slowly, his jaw tight, his defiance simmering beneath the surface. Clara walked toward him, each step heavy, deliberate. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "You think this is a game?" she hissed. "You think disrespect has no price?" The class held its breath. Jason didn't answer. Something inside her cracked open, something dark and raw. She grabbed his desk, shoved it back with sudden force. The screech of metal against tile pierced the silence. Jason stumbled, his face pale, his mask of rebellion breaking into shock. For a moment, time stopped. Clara saw what she had done, the fear in Jason's eyes, the gasps of his classmates. She should have stepped back. She should have apologized. But the principal was there, watching, his arms crossed, his lips curled in approval. And Clara felt it again, that strange, heavy rush. Power. Jason sat down quietly, his defiance gone, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. The classroom stayed silent for the rest of the period. Nobody dared to move. When the final bell rang, Clara stayed at her desk, her body trembling. She could still hear the scrape of metal, still see Jason's stunned expression. She hated herself for it. She wanted to take it back. But another voice whispered, low and poisonous, "He'll never challenge you again. And isn't that what you wanted?" That evening, her mother asked how her day had gone. Clara smiled tightly, muttered something about paperwork, and changed the subject. She couldn't admit what she'd done. Saying it aloud would make it real. But reality was already pressing down on her. The students looked at her differently, now not just with fear, but with something colder. They avoided her gaze. Some flinched when she raised her hand to point at the board. Even Jason, once loud and restless, had fallen into silence. Clara told herself she had control, that everything was under control. But when she lay in bed that night, the dream returned. The hallway again, the locked steel doors. But this time, one door was open. Inside, Jason sat in the corner, his face pale, his desk overturned. Clara stepped inside, but instead of speaking, she pushed the door shut. The lock clicked, loud and final. She woke with a gasp, her chest heaving, her sheets tangled tight around her legs. The taste of iron lingered in her mouth, though she hadn't bitten her tongue. The next morning, the principal stopped her in the hall. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "Yesterday." That was exactly the kind of discipline this school needs. Keep it up. Clara froze. His words were a reward, a stamp of approval. And yet they made her stomach twist. She nodded slowly, but inside something screamed. She wasn't sure if it was guilt or desire, because a terrible truth was dawning on her. She didn't just fear the darkness growing inside her. Part of her wanted it. Clara Hayes woke before dawn, her body restless, her mind clawing for escape from another nightmare. This one had been worse. Jason again, but not as a student. He was older, taller, his eyes blazing with accusation. He had shouted at her through the steel door, his fists pounding until her ears rang. She had stood frozen, unable to move, until blood trickled from under the door. When she sat up in bed, her throat was dry, her pulse racing. She told herself it was just a dream. But it didn't feel like one. It felt like a warning. At school, the tension had only grown thicker. Students no longer whispered about Clara. They avoided her altogether. Their silence carried its own kind of cruelty. Every step she took through the halls felt like walking through a storm cloud. Jason, once loud and unbreakable, now kept his head down. He scribbled notes furiously, avoided her eyes, answered only when called upon. He had been broken, or maybe he was just waiting. Clara couldn't tell. That uncertainty gnawed at her. The principal, meanwhile, seemed delighted. He lingered in her classroom more than ever, his presence heavy in the doorway. Every time Clara raised her voice, every time she snapped at a student, his smile grew sharper. It wasn't support, it was surveillance. She realized with a jolt that he wasn't just watching her. He was shaping her. The moment came on a Thursday afternoon. The air was thick with unease. Jason had finished his assignment early, and instead of sitting quietly, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. Tap, tap. Clara's nerves twitched with each sound. She had told him once to stop, twice. By the third, her chest felt like it might explode. "Jason," she said, her voice low, dangerous. "Put the pen down." He smirked, the old defiance flickering back to life. And that was it. Clara moved without thinking. She stormed down the aisle, snatched the pen from his hand, and slammed it against the desk so hard the plastic snapped in two. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. The students gasped. Jason flinched, his face pale. Clara stood over him, the broken pieces of the pen digging into her palm. She could feel the sting of plastic against her skin, a bead of blood rising where it cut. Her voice came out like ice. "Do you think this is funny?" Jason shook his head quickly, eyes wide. The smirk was gone. All that remained was fear. Clara leaned closer, her hand pressing on his desk, her face inches from his. "If you ever test me again," she whispered, "I will make sure you regret it." The words weren't planned. They came from somewhere dark, somewhere she hadn't wanted to admit existed. The class was silent. Nobody moved. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to hold its breath. After class, Clara sat alone, the broken pen still in her hand. She stared at the blood on her palm, the tiny cut throbbing. It wasn't much, but it was real. A piece of evidence that something inside her had shifted. And then, something worse. She realized she didn't feel guilt this time. Not really. Instead, she felt relief. That night, she couldn't bring herself to visit her mother at the hospital. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, the broken pen pieces beside her, her mind spiraling. She thought about Jason's face, the fear in his eyes, the way his smirk had vanished. She replayed it again and again, and each time she felt stronger. But underneath that strength was something dangerous, a craving. She wanted more. The next morning, Clara caught her reflection in the mirror before leaving for work. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes sharp and hollow, her lips curled in something that looked far too much like a sneer. For the first time, she asked herself the question she had avoided for weeks. What if this isn't stress? What if this is who I really am? And that thought chilled her more than anything else ever had. Clara Hayes could no longer tell where her work ended and where she began. Every morning she woke with her jaw sore from clenching it in her sleep, her hands stiff from curling into fists. The shadows under her eyes had deepened into bruises. When she stepped into the school now, students didn't just avoid her, they feared her. The whispers had stopped altogether, replaced by silence so thick it felt like suffocation. Clara told herself it was respect. Deep down, she knew it wasn't. Jason no longer tested her. He sat still, quiet, his pencil never daring to tap again. But his silence unnerved her more than his defiance ever had. She could feel his hatred like static in the air, invisible but crackling, waiting. The principal lingered often. He rarely spoke, but his eyes never left her. Every time Clara balked at a student or slammed a book on a desk, she swore she saw approval in his smile. She hated that smile, and yet some small part of her needed it. At night, the classroom followed her home. She couldn't stop hearing the snap of that pen, Jason's flinch, the way her threat had tasted bitter and sweet on her tongue. She thought about it while she cooked, while she folded laundry, while she drove to the hospital to see her mother. Her mother, frail and fading in the hospital bed, had always been her tether, but now even that was slipping. Clara sat by her side, trying to mask the storm inside her. "How was your day, honey?" her mother asked, her voice weak but warm. Clara forced a smile. "Fine, busy, but fine." Her mother's eyes narrowed. Even sick, she could still read her daughter too well. "You don't look fine. You look tired." Clara swallowed hard. She wanted to confess, to pour out the darkness that had taken root inside her, but the words stuck. If her mother knew, if anyone knew, what she had become. Instead, Clara said softly, "I just need rest." Her mother squeezed her hand gently, her frail fingers trembling. "Don't lose yourself, Clara. Promise me that." Clara nodded, but the promise tasted like a lie. Days blurred together. Clara's temper grew sharper, her control thinner. At the grocery store, when a stranger's cart blocked the aisle, she snapped at him with such venom that he recoiled, muttering an apology. At a red light, when another driver honked impatiently, Clara rolled down her window and screamed words she hadn't thought herself capable of. It wasn't just the classroom anymore. The fury had followed her out, slipped its leash, found new places to feed. And each time she unleashed it, she felt lighter, freer, yet more afraid of herself. One evening, Clara returned home and found her apartment colder than usual. She flicked the light on and froze. On her kitchen table sat a small, white envelope. No return address. No markings. Her chest tightened as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 4 words typed in bold black letters. "We're watching you, Clara." Her stomach dropped. Her first thought was Jason. Her second was the principal. The walls seemed to close in, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. Clara stumbled back, the paper shaking in her hands. Someone knew. Someone had seen what she had done, what she was becoming. Her breath came quick, shallow. For the first time, she felt not just powerful but hunted. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment, every shadow in the hallway, felt like proof she wasn't alone. She sat in bed clutching a kitchen knife, her knuckles white, waiting for someone to come through the door. But nothing did. Only the silence pressed on, heavy and suffocating. The next morning, Clara stood in front of her bathroom mirror. Her reflection looked foreign, her eyes sharp and hollow, her mouth set in a grim line. "Who are you?" she whispered to the glass. The woman staring back didn't answer. But Clara already knew. She was no longer the teacher who believed in kindness. She was no longer the daughter her mother would recognize. She was something else now, something forged by pressure, fear, and rage. And the terrifying part? She wasn't sure she wanted to stop. The school bell rang, but Clara Hayes didn't hear it. She sat at her desk, the note still folded in her pocket, like a weight pressing against her chest. "We're watching you, Clara." The words looped in her mind, louder than the chatter of students filing in. Jason entered last. His eyes met hers briefly before darting away. His silence was sharper than any insult, sharper than the pencil he gripped tight. Clara's heart thudded. He knew something. The principal appeared in the doorway, as he so often did now. He didn't speak, didn't move, just leaned against the frame, his smile thin, watching. Always watching. The air in the classroom felt electric, charged, as if waiting for a spark to set it ablaze. Clara's throat tightened. "Open your books," she said, her voice too harsh, too quick. No one moved. Clara's stomach knotted. Now, still silence. A classroom of eyes bore into her, not fearful, not submissive. Something else, something darker. Jason finally raised his head. His voice, quiet but steady, cut the silence. "We saw what you did." Clara froze. Her pulse roared in her ears. Jason's hands trembled, but his stare didn't waver. "You think no one noticed the way you slammed my desk? The way you—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "We're not afraid of you anymore." The note. It hadn't come from the principal. It hadn't been a warning from above. It had come from them, the students. Clara's chest constricted. Her hands itched to slam the desk again, to shout, to remind them who held the power. But her voice caught. She saw the way they sat, not shrinking, but steady, united. And then she saw the principal. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was cold, almost expectant, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. "You wanted respect," Jason whispered, "but all you gave us was fear." Clara's breath cracked. Her throat burned. What could she say? That she hadn't meant for this to happen? That she was just tired, just broken, just human? No words could erase the monster they now saw standing at the front of the room. Her hands trembled as she reached for the chalk, desperate to cling to routine. But her fingers slipped, chalk snapping in half. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. The class flinched, not in fear this time, but in recognition. The mask had slipped. That night, Clara didn't go home. She sat in her car outside the school long after the sun had set, staring at the darkened windows. Her reflection in the windshield looked hollow, her eyes rimmed red. Her phone buzzed with a call from the hospital. She didn't answer. She couldn't bear to hear her mother's voice, not now. Not when the truth of who she had become had finally come crashing down. The darkness wasn't just in the classroom anymore. It was inside her, woven into every breath, every thought. And the scariest part, it hadn't been forced on her. It had been waiting for the right cracks to open, the right pressures to push her past the line. Clara Hayes had always believed she was one of the good ones. That kindness defined her. That cruelty belonged to other people. But tonight, staring at her reflection in the glass, she finally saw the truth. Good people don't just do evil things. They become them. The story of Clara isn't just hers, it's ours. It's proof of how fragile the line is, how close any of us might be to breaking, how darkness doesn't come from nowhere, but grows in the cracks of ordinary life. And maybe, just maybe, the scariest part isn't the monster in others. It's the one waiting in us.
If Clara's story gripped you, don't stop here. Share it, talk about it, and explore more stories that dive into the psychology of evil. Subscribe for the next journey, and remember, the scariest truths are the ones closest to home.